was about 13 years old, I was just discovering rockabilly. That was kind of when the United States had a big rockabilly revival. And of course, the Stray Cats were very popular. They actually had hit songs that were on the charts. And when that started happening, all of a sudden, the companies started reissuing some of the older 50s music. And I was very young, maybe 13 years old, and went into the record store and I saw this record, Gene Vincent, The Bop That Just Won't Stop. And it was one of those classic 80s reissue vinyl LPs. And I bought it and I took it home and wow, I mean, that was it. That was all it took. I also bought the Eddie Cochran Legendary Masters series the same day. So my mind was blown for months and years afterwards. That was all it took. Well, Gene always gets identified as a rockabilly artist, but he's not really rockabilly. That's the interesting thing about it is his whole musical thing is it's very unique. I mean, it's rock and roll, but there's elements of kind of swing and jazz and stuff in it. But I wouldn't classify him really as a rockabilly. The bass player never slapped the bass. They did a lot of sort of jazzy arrangements, especially with Cliff Gallop's guitar playing. But at the same time, it was definitely rock and roll. So I still don't know exactly how you would classify Gene Vincent, but he's definitely unique among all those 50s artists. Well, I'm a little bit biased because I'm a guitar player, but I really think that Gene had a great talent, but I think that it would have been a completely different story about Gene Vincent if he hadn't had the Blue Caps, and especially Cliff Gallup playing guitar for him, especially at the beginning. I mean, to knock it out of the park with a hit like Bebopalula, everything about that record is perfect, and I can't imagine changing anything about it. So it really took a combination of those musicians and Gene in that studio at that exact time to make that lightning bolt happen. Well, I think that when you get thrust into that rock and roll lifestyle and touring and driving like mad to make these shows and staying up late nights and not sleeping in your own bed, I remember reading an interview with Cliff Gallup where he just said, he just didn't like being on the road. And I think that Gene's schedule was so crazy. That's probably what did them all in one by one. Is those guys just didn't like being on the road. And I think that's eventually why he got that group in '57, with all the young guys like Tommy Facenda and those guys. They were all kind of like around the same age. Whereas that first group, I think that Cliff Gallup and Jack Neal were quite a bit older than the rest of the guys. Gene had a giant hit right out of the gate with Bebopalula, and then he had Lotta Lovin' and Dance to the Bop. But I think by '59, his records just weren't selling anymore. I know because I've sort of obsessively studied Gene Vincent. If you look at the places that he was playing in '56 and '57 were, big rock and roll package tours where he was playing stadiums and fairs and these enormous audiences. And by 1959, he was playing little VFW clubs and things like that to maybe 200 people or something. So it doesn't surprise me that Capitol dropped him. The guy made some great records, for one thing. When you make records that great, I think that you can coast off of that forever. And it's kind of a shame that Gene died as young as he did because those records are so great. He could get booked anywhere today if he were still alive. And the thing about the audiences in the UK and Europe, they always had that hardcore sort of Teddy Boy following where those audiences didn't care if he wasn't on the charts anymore. They just knew that he was good. So he kept working over there, and those audiences still love him over here today. When I first started playing guitar, I got into collecting records, and I realized very early on that it's very important to own a copy of each of the original 6 Capitol LPs. And so this is back in the 1980s. I actually sought out original copies of all of the 6 Capitol LPs, and then as I got to meet various blue caps and play with them, I had all of them sign them. So that's something that I'm really happy that I did now that a lot of them have passed away. Um, I moved to Los Angeles in early 1991, and I formed a band called the Dave and Deke Combo. And we were playing around locally, doing some shows, and then we found out like we're going to get to back up Johnny Meeks. And I mean, man, it was like unbelievable for me. I couldn't believe that I was actually going to get to play with a real blue cap. And learning all these songs, preparing for the gig, and then the day of the show comes, and Johnny comes in. He's just like this totally normal guy, no rock star pretense at all. He's just a good old boy, and he's just got to get through another gig. And when he found out that we were big Gene Vincent fans, he, I think he was a little bit bummed out because Johnny did a lot of country gigs where he would play 4 straight hours of country music. And when he found out that we wanted to do some of the Gene Vincent songs, that was kind of deviating from his normal thing. But man, once he started doing that stuff and he was playing those leads the way that he did them, that was like one of the most unforgettable moments in my life is when I got to play with Johnny Meeks. When Elvis first started out and he became very big, he had an image that was very sort of upbeat, and he was rock and roll guy. He was moving around on stage. And Gene had this other thing that I think translated very well into later types of music. It was this kind of like suspense and danger and pain on his face from his leg injury. And, you can see that with guys like Jim Morrison. I mean, they saw that and they copied that into their own music, whereas a lot of guys didn't take the Elvis thing later on into the 60s and 70s. I think the Gene Vincent image, that whole aura that he had worked very well for a lot of later performers. I'm very honored to be one of the few guys that can say that I got to play with Russel Williford, who's sort of like the great lost blue cap. He's the guy that's on the cover of the second album playing this Fender Esquire guitar, but he never recorded with Gene Vincent. He was actually a great guitar player. He played with a bunch of guys in the Washington, D.C. area, but he never recorded with Gene. Um, Sort of a forgotten name, but a few years ago I got approached by the people who put on the Richmond, Virginia Folk Festival, and they were going to do a special thing about Virginia rockabilly guys called Virginia Rocks. And they brought in the Dazzlers, who were a rockabilly band from Virginia, and the last guy who was alive from the Rocketeens, who did Woohoo. And they brought in Russel Williford, and they had me come in to back up these guys. And for me, it was like, wow, Russel Williford. I never thought I would get to meet the guy, much less play with him. It's a shame that he couldn't have lived longer. If he could have lived into the 80s or 90s, I think that he would have really seen how much that he influenced people and how much his music meant. It's sad that he died in 1971 because that was like the height of hippie culture, the height of acid rock and hard rock, and I always think like he must have just thought that the world was ending, and music was over, and nobody cared about him anymore. And you hear these stories that Ronnie Weiser tells of Gene playing these gigs around LA for $40 or something like that. And I always think, what a shame, for a guy to die like that, because he probably thought he had been forgotten. So it's just too bad that he couldn't have lived another 10 years or another 20 years so that he could have been fully appreciated. Well, one of the saddest things that I've seen is that documentary where he's over in England, like late 60s, and he's trying to teach the band his songs, and they don't know any of his songs, and you're going to see this like look on his face, like, oh shit, here I go again, playing with a bunch of hippie musicians that don't know my music. Um, but what I do notice is all these years later, there's still all these young kids that are discovering rockabilly and rock and roll. And it's the same thing that happened to me. It's probably the same thing that happened to you. The minute that you first hear those classic Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps recordings, you're like, wow, that's it. That's like the best there is. So in that sense, I think that they're still going to be listening to those records 500 years from now and saying, wow, that's fantastic. That's great. It doesn't really matter what Lady Gaga or whoever's on the popular charts is thinking. I think that anybody who really likes music that gets to your soul, when they hear those records, they're going to appreciate them. I got one other good story if you want to hear it.
Sure.
So in 1996, the Blue Caps did a tour of the United States and they played in Los Angeles. And that was when I was going to get a lot of my records signed. And I showed up around 6 p.m. and man, they were already drunk. I mean, man, they weren't going on until midnight, something like that. But they were all really hammered. So I was trying to, chase them around the club to get them to sign autographs. And I was in the trailer behind the club, and Paul Peak was quite inebriated, and he was talking to this woman named Judy. And he was hitting on her. And I handed Paul my record. I'm like, hey, Paul, sign this to Deke. And then, he's like talking to Judy for another 5 minutes or something. And then he picks up the record and he signs it to Judy, Paul Peak. So one of my records, for no reason at all, says to Judy, Paul Peak.